Good morning, Lakeview. Good morning. How's everyone doing? Fantastic. That's awesome, chat. We are continuing our study of the book of Deuteronomy. We're going to be just covering 4 chapters today. Yeah. When I saw my lesson breakdown, I was like, why 4 chapters this week and then 8 chapters next week? What was I thinking? And then I got into my notes and I understood why. Yeah, I had a lot to talk about in one of these chapters. So, I always like to start out with a quote. So I like this one. So like the rest of the ancient world, Israel considered God the cause of every effect and is actively shaping events. Their historiography was intended to be not simply a record of events or assemblage of facts, but a record of the ways in which God had acted in history. No Israelite historiography is secular. Yahweh is the driving force of history and the raison d'etre of a historiography. I cannot say that word. Historiography. The transcendent view of history characterizes both Israelite and ancient Near Eastern historiography. So again, God is responsible for everything. That's how they saw things. Like, take the Red Sea crossing. It says God caused a wind to part the Red Sea. In theory, the right wind against the right body of water could do that. And you would say that's a natural event, but it happened just when they needed to cross. And it lasted long enough for them to get across, but not for the Egyptians, right? So even if it was, say, a natural wind, it was still planned by God that way. So that's a way of looking at miracles. That sometimes you could say it's a natural event, but the timing is what's suspicious. But that's a side point. Here's my bibliography again. A lot of these books are really worth reading, especially if you want to understand the Torah and what the ancients believed about it. Yeah.
God made it dry fast, though, right?
That's true. It does say he made it dry fast. He also said he hindered the chariots.
Okay.
Right. But you'll come across people that'll say it's a natural wind did it.
Okay.
I can show you a guy who works for the United States National Weather Forecasting, and he modeled it, and he said hey, it could do it with this wind in this situation. So again, the book of Deuteronomy is a suzerain vassal treaty between God and Israel. God is the over-king of Israel. Right? And we are still in the specific stipulations of the treaty. These are the laws that we've been going through, and you'll see we'll be still going through them next week too. As it is the bulk of Deuteronomy is the specific stipulations. So, Deuteronomy 15 is about economic laws, right? We've been told this in Deuteronomy and the other places in the Torah that every 7 years, you're supposed to let your lands lie fallow, but you're also supposed to forgive debts and release slaves, at least Israelite slaves, right? This was to stop people who have gotten into horrible situations a chance to have a second chance in their life, right? Loans, even though there isn't currency at this time, were still very common. And interest and all that stuff, very common, even though they don't have coins. Everything's still done in ingots of gold or by weight of materials, right? And nations, right, they would use their mineral and agricultural wealth to invest, right? You have all this stuff, so let's make more money with it like we do today. They would invest in international trade, right? You would find a merchant and you would supply him with material and he would promise you a return. He would promise the nation a return on the investment. At least 100% was quite common back then, right? So you'd fund his ships, you'd fund his caravans, all right? And the merchant, he would be promising to successfully sell all that stuff and bring you back the return on investment, all right? But farmers also took loans, right? For seed, for equipment, for animals, right? And so if the farmer has a good harvest, he would be able to pay back the debt. But if not, he might have to sell his land. He might have to go into debt slavery, right? That might first start with selling your son, right? Or a daughter. And then maybe it has to come to selling yourself. That's just how it was back then. There was no, welfare net, right? But every 7 years, Israel is ordered to forgive these sorts of debts for the farmers, for the craftsmen, for their brothers who have fallen on hard times and have ended up in these situations. Foreigners, and not sojourners who are living in the land, but foreigners are not freed from debt obligation because it's a business transaction, right? These are wealthy merchants that have made promises to return investments, right? Not the little small amount that a farmer's borrowing. And so they're not to be forgiven for their debts. That's what Deuteronomy says. So Israel is allowed to invest in foreign nations this way. They're allowed to make these sort of deals. However, they're not supposed to take these loans on themselves. They're not supposed to get into economic debt as a nation to other nations because that puts that nation over them, right? It's like today, right? You know, how much is our national debt? Exactly? It's a lot. And then there's a lot of nations that owe us money, right? That are in economic debt to us, and it's a whole complicated thing, but it's a place where you can put pressure on a nation if they owe you money. And Israel's not supposed to end up in that way. But the 7-year law to forgive other debts, that's for the common person, that's for the poor, that's for the person that's fallen on hard times, right? That's who God cares about, not a merchant that is already wealthy, and maybe he lost a ship, right? So, God commands if an Israelite is poor, then to lend enough to meet his needs. Don't, if he comes to you and says, I need this, don't be skimpy on him. Take care, at least there's an unworthy thought in your heart when you do this, God says. Like, don't think of if I give him this loan now, in 2 years I'm going to have to forgive it, and he's probably not going to pay me back. God says, don't think about that, right? You need to just be generous, right? That's what he wants you to have. And he wants you to be, not to do it with an unworthy thought in your heart, right? As he tells us, right? To be a cheerful giver. If you ignore the poor, it's a sin against God. Having a giving heart is important because there will always be poor people. That's just a reality of how economics works. Someone is always going to be at the bottom of a lot of someone, sadly. We've yet to find an economic system where that has not happened. So, verse 12 talks about buying a brother who is a Hebrew man or woman as a slave, and now they have to be released on the 7th year. Right? This is, again, debt slavery, and you're purchasing them, you're probably buying them from a foreigner, right? So they've ended up in slavery to a foreigner, and you're buying them out of the foreigner's hands into your own. You've got to release them after the 7 years, at the 7-year period. And it's interesting that the Bible uses Hebrew here, right? This is a word that seems to mean a Semitic person who's like a gypsy, who's destitute, who's living in foreign lands, who's a sojourner, right? A stranger, an alien. This is what this word sojourner means, right? We even have references outside the Bible to Hebrews, the Habaru, in Canaanite writings, and they were nomadic groups, and sometimes they caused problems. They acted as mercenaries, but it seemed to be there are people without a land, right? And that term Hebrew, right, it comes from Eber, right? He's one of Shem's descendants and one of Abraham's ancestors. So it's a broader term than Israelites, right? You can be a Hebrew and not be an Israelite. But it does seem to relate to what your condition is. There's an interesting comment on why we have this book in the New Testament called the Letter to the Hebrews, probably written to Jews that are not living in their land, but living in a foreign land, hence why it's used that way. So we get the same laws about slavery as found in Exodus, including if you want to stay a slave, that is your choice. If you're like, I think this guy's a good master, and you know what, I'd rather just spend my life working for him than going out on my own, well, you do the ear-piercing thing with the owl to the door and saying, like, I'm here to be their servant for the rest of my life. Otherwise, the end of 7 years, man or woman, and this is an addition from the Exodus text, it includes woman here, is considered to have paid off their debts. Lastly, God claimed all male firstborn of the herd and the flock, right? They must be sacrificed to the Lord, having never been worked or sheared, right? So you don't get to do that one shearing of the wool off that male lamb before you send them off to the sacrifice. However, if it is a seriously blemished, like it's lame, it's blind, disease maybe, I don't know, then it should be killed and eaten in town. You still can't use it for the economic labor, but it's also not worthy enough to be sacrificed to God. But you don't get to just keep it. But God makes this concession here. Because again, you can't control if the firstborn animal out of your new sheep comes out lame or blind, right? That's not on you.
James,
Yeah.
what does that mean, eating in town? What goes into that?
Well, you eat it at your town.
Are you other people eating it with you?
I mean, presumably. I mean, it depends what animal you're slaughtering.
Okay.
Like if you had a blemished, cow, ox, or whatever, I could feed a lot of people.
Right.
A sheep can feed a family.
Okay.
Right, so chapter 16 has laws on the festivals and appointment of officials. So we get laws on the three pilgrimages that an Israelite man is required to go to the sanctuary to participate in. And that's the festival of Passover / unleavened bread, because they take place at the same time. And weeks, and then booths in the fall. So there are 2 other festivals they're supposed to celebrate, trumpet and atonement, but only those 3, the Passover and unleavened bread combo, weeks and booths, are the ones that an Israelite man is required to go to the sanctuary every year. And they're not supposed to come empty-handed, it says. This is probably when you bring your firstborn sacrifices, your tithes for the year. This would be the opportune time to do that, right? And then Moses, all throughout talking about them, these festivals, stresses that they're to remember that they were slaves in Egypt, that the Lord delivered them from bondage, and to rejoice to the Lord with your loved ones because the Lord has blessed you. Right? These festivals are times to be altogether joyful. That's one of the purposes of them, right? To celebrate what God has done for you with those you love. Isn't that beautiful? Yeah. And then the chapter shifts to legislation of judges and officers, right? Maybe this could have been a new chapter. But you shall not pervert justice, it says, by taking bribes, which blinds even the wise, right? Greed can make a wise person do dumb things, all right? Verse 20 says, justice, and only justice you shall follow, that you may live and inherit the land that the Lord your God is giving you. Again, reinforcing that follow the commands, it'll go well with you in the land. Over and over and over, Moses is reinforcing this lesson. The same thing for your officials, for your judges, right? Like today in many places, bribes are a major problem today as they are in the ancient Near East. I mean, they're a part of the world where you can't get anything done if you're not bribing every single official that you come across, because that's just how it is. But Proverbs 6:35, Micah 3:11, and 7:3, and Ezra 4:4-5 speak of this problem, right? The 9th commandment stresses how important this is, right? It's a commandment not to give false witness. Well, if you bribe the judge, that's kind of a form of false witness, isn't it? Right? You're getting the judge to lie for you, basically, or to rule for you. Micah 6:8 says, right, he has told you, God, right, has told you, oh man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you but to do justice, and to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God, right? That's what God requires of us. Do justice. Don't pervert it. Don't lie. Don't bribe. Then we get laws on worship and governments here in Deuteronomy 17. Well, actually, it starts at the last 2 verses of 16, which probably should be part of chapter 17. But those 2 verses say, God has commanded you not to plant a tree or erect an Asherah pole, which is a symbolic tree, beside the altar to God, right? God is saying he does not have a wife. Asherah is the wife of the head god of Canaan, and she often gets associated with Yahweh. We see this in pagan artifacts where there's been synchronization between the pagan religion and Yahweh. But God says, don't do this, especially not in his temple. That makes him really, really angry. Read Ezekiel, right? So don't do that. Do not sacrifice animals with blemish. It's abominable. God requires the best, right? Don't just, give whatever. Don't be Cain. Right? Whatever Cain did wrong, it doesn't say he gave his first fruits. It says Abel gave his firstborn, and Cain just gave some fruit. So, if anyone is found worshiping pagan gods or celestial objects, they are to be taken to the entrance of town and stoned to death by the community. But there must be at least 2 or 3 witnesses to them doing this, right? With one witness, it's a he said, she said situation, and how do you know who's telling the truth, right? So you can't punish someone when you can't tell who is the liar, right? So you need at least 2 witnesses to testify that someone has, broken a commandment. And here's the thing. If you're the witness, one of these witnesses, you have to be the ones to throw the first stones. So you better be sure of what you witness because, if you're wrong, if you're lying, the blood of that person is going to be on you. Yeah. But also, you know what? Sometimes crimes are complicated. It's hard to tell how to parse them out. Is this murder? Is this manslaughter? Is this a rape? Or is this, seduction, right? Stuff like that. Well, when it's complicated, you go to the sanctuary, you go to the Levitical priest, you go to the judge, and you say, hey, let's figure this out, right? You go to someone who's wise, someone who has more authority. And you do it before the Lord. And you must respect their decision, right? If you don't like what the priest or the judge has ruled, well, you still have to abide by their decision. And if you don't, it's a death sentence. You disagree with the judge's punishment and you say, no, maybe I'm not going to pay that fine you told me to pay. Well, that's what you're risking. So God has put these people in place. Respect their judgments. And all the people shall hear and fear and not act presumptuously again. That's referring to the last section, right? So that's the point of why you would put them to death. It's an object lesson, right? Then it switches on to one day, God will set a king over Israel, like the other nations. We're given some criteria for this king, right? The king cannot be a foreigner. He must be an Israelite from among your brothers. Only the king is allowed to buy horses. He's even allowed to buy horses from Egypt. In other words, he's allowed to amass military power, is what that's saying. Because these horses are going to be for chariots. All right? And Egypt has really good horses at this time, which is interesting because you go back 600 years, and Egypt didn't have horses at all. But now they do, and they have some really good ones. However, he also shouldn't have more than one wife, lest his heart turn away. So, a king usually acquires wives by making treaties with foreign powers. Israel has one treaty with God and with no other. But sadly, this one gets broken a lot by the kings of Israel and Judah. Nor shall a king amass material wealth. A king amassing gold is not investing his economic power back into his people, into his lands. And also, how do you get all that money? If you've got a hoard of treasure in your vault, it's because you're overtaxing the people. You're putting a burden on them because you're being greedy. So once the king is on the throne, he must make his own copy of the book of Deuteronomy. And it explicitly says in verse 18, this law he must copy. Right? It's not talking about the entire Torah, it is talking about this one, yes?
I have a question about verse 16. I didn't think they were supposed to go back to Egypt on that.
That's why this is an exception. The future king is given the exception to do this. That's why there's a specific section that they're carving out here. That's specifically just for the king, is my understanding. Here, let me pull up the text on my phone. Oh, maybe I misread this verse. I'm sorry. I think so, yeah. You're right. He's not allowed to go to Egypt. I'm sorry. I misread this verse when I was putting this all together. So he really shouldn't be getting horses from Egypt, is what it says there, which makes sense from the rest of the Bible. So I apologize. That is a mistake. Thank you for catching that, please. Yeah, I think I missed the never. I think I just saw you shall over. I'm like, that's weird. All right, well, I'm sorry for that. All right.
What's the truth?
Oh, it says you shall never. I misread the text when I put this together. Sorry. So, he is supposed to copy the book of Deuteronomy, right? Make his own copy, right? Under the supervision of the Levitical priests. and he's to read it all his days. The law will be a wisdom text for the king and for the officials on how to judge criminals in civil disputes. Right? Because the king must learn to fear the Lord, uphold God's statutes, and be humble, so he not think he is better than his brothers. Right? Just because you're the king of Israel doesn't mean you're better than the other Israelites, is what God is saying here. This means the king is bound to the law, not the source of the law, like with all the surrounding empires. God is the source of the law. All right? This is a very different from every other culture around them. So, if the king does this, Israel's kingdom will continue for generations. But only one Davidic king ever fully upheld the statutes. Right? And we all know who I'm referencing here?
Christ.
Thank you. Yes, Christ. So, and then we come here to chapter 18. So the Levites do not get to receive land inheritance because the Lord is their inheritance. The priests are due a portion of sacrifices and they get the tithe. And the Levites who leave their home to serve at the sanctuary also are supported by these offerings by the tithe. And they have to tithe the tithe back to the priest. So that's covered elsewhere. It's not actually mentioned here. But there's also, so they're allowed to get that, this payment from the tithe in addition to the sale of their patrimony. It's a very unusual word, patrimony. No one is quite sure what the phrase "the sale of their patrimony" means. Not the word patrimony, but why this phrase, right? So the word patrimony literally is of his ancestors. So what of his ancestors is he selling? Is what's the confusion, right? There's some sort of income the Levites may or may not have access to that this is referring to, that we have just lost to history, that this phrase didn't survive. It's only used, I think, here. But whatever the source of any additional income they might have from maybe they have a job in their hometown or whatever, their share of the tithe when they're working in the temple is not to be limited by it. So they still get their fair pay for working in the temple, regardless of any other source of income they may or may not have, is I think what this is saying. And then God says, once you're in the land, do not follow the abominable practices of the nations. These are, don't burn your children as offerings, practice divinations, tell fortunes, interpret omens, be a sorcerer, a charmer, a medium, or a necromancer. These are all abominable to the Lord. By the way, this burning the children here is not just sacrificing your children, but probably sacrificing them for a divination or magical purpose, given that it's in the same list as all these magical practices. So this is really bad. Like you're killing your child to practice magic. It's pretty gross.
What's a necro?
Someone who speaks to the dead.
Okay.
So divinations, fortunes or omens, are a variety of ways of interpreting signs. Back then, they read the entrails of sacrificial animals. That was a major way of omen. So you sacrifice the animal, and the priest would look at the entrails, and he would go like, the gods are wanting us to do blah, 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 blah. Based on how the liver's shaped, how the things came out. It's a whole complicated system. Yeah, today we have like tarot reading, astrology, palmistry. These would all fall into this same category. All right. We don't gut animals anymore, but we do these other stuffs. So sorcery is using magic to manipulate the supernatural realm. This would include healing and exorcisms for the pagan practices. They would use sorcery for those good purposes, but you could also use it for wicked purposes. So charmers or witches would specialize in casting spells to manipulate a human, right? And mediums and necromancers speak with the dead through various means to seek knowledge from the dead and not from a god, right? So they're like reaching for knowledge from the dead instead of knowledge from the gods, like the other forms of divinations here. And it's for all these practices that God has condemned the Canaanites. Yeah, she's a medium. The witch of Endor would be a medium. She's calling up a spirit. A necromancer might be having a natural body in front of him and trying to get the spirit of that body to re-inhabit it to talk to them. That's kind of the difference between a medium and a necromancer.
That sounds scary.
Yeah. It's abhorrent. There's a reason why this stuff's abominable, right? And the Lord said to me, They are right in what they have spoken. I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among their brothers. Right? This is very, very early prophecy for Jesus here. Right? So it's a prophecy about a prophet that is like Moses, right? One who speaks face to face with God. One who delivers new legislation / covenant. No other prophet, Isaiah, Elijah, Elisha, Jeremiah, none of them delivered new legislation or covenant. Right? And who is a leader of Israel? Right? None of them are leaders. Only Moses is a leader of Israel. Only Moses delivers a covenant. Only Moses speaks face to face with God until Christ. Right? And not Muhammad. If you deal with Muslims, they're going to go to this passage and claim when it says, from among your brothers means Ishmael, who they'll say is a brother of Israel, and that it's talking about Muhammad, because they'll be like, Muhammad ruled. Muhammad gave new legislation. But Muhammad never spoke face to face with God. He spoke to an angel named Gabriel. Right? Gabriel told him what God said. Not once did God really ever speak directly to Muhammad. No, he claimed an angel would speak to him and tell him what God said. That's what he claimed. And sometimes Satan. There was an embarrassing time when he said, like, you can worship these 3 pagan goddesses. And then he said, no, wait, that was Satan, and Satan tricked me, and now we got to remove these verses from the Quran. Salman Rushdie wrote a book about it called The Satanic Verses, and he's lived in hiding all his life. 20 years after he wrote it, a Muslim attacked him and blinded him in one eye, right? Because he dared to reveal what their prophet did. But that's a side point. Peter says in Acts 3:22-23, Christ is the prophet like Moses, right? Second, this passage is also speaking about other prophets that speak for God, right? Since Israel after Sinai does not want to hear from God directly, they need prophets to speak for them, right? So God will call these prophets to challenge the establishment, to remind leaders and people to obey the covenant, to provide warnings of impending judgment. That's how God uses his prophets as we go forward. So since a prophet speaks for God, you can't charge him with treason or doomsaying, right? You can't, Jeremiah throwing him in a cistern, that's not right. It's not Jeremiah saying these things that scared you. I can't remember the name of that king, but it's God. He's just speaking for God. So you're not supposed to punish a prophet for what he says, if he's a true prophet. So, however, a prophet who claims to be speaking for God and is not must be killed. And we are given 2 criteria to judge them. One is they speak a message that contradicts God, like worshiping other gods or acts God has declared abominable. And 2, they make predictions that do not come to pass. A false prophet, though, can make accurate predictions. So just because he predicts something and it comes true does not automatically make him a true prophet, because if his message contradicts God's revealed word, he's still false. So, we've been given quite a lot of things that are outlawed, right? But there's also prophecy, right? Which is a form of divination. So we've been told a bunch of divination forms are outlawed, and yet prophecies and prophets are allowed. Why are some forms outlawed and some aren't, right? So we have 2 categories of divination called deductive divination, and most of that is forbidden to Israel, and inspired divination, which was approved. So I thought we'd go into why God doesn't like some of these forms of divinations, right? But other forms are allowed, right? So deductive divination is things like tarot card reading or astrology or reading tea leaves. It's about interpreting omens. Casting lots, though, also falls into this category, right? As does using the ermine and the thummim by the high priest. We're not exactly sure how those 2 stones helped tell the priest what God wanted, but it is a form of deductive divination. And those later 2 are allowed, but all the other forms were forbidden. Very interesting. But inspired divination was also allowed, as long as the prophet passes the test. So a prophet, a seer, or a dreamer, right, can have revelation from God. And you should listen to it if he is proven true, right? So a prophet is someone who communicates God's words. A seer is someone who describes a vision God gave him. And a dreamer is someone that explains a dream from God, right? And Israel's prophets can fall into any of those three categories or even multiple of them, right? We have, Isaiah both gives the word of God, but he also sees visions from God, as an example.
So God's hands are always in the casting of lots?
Yeah, God allowed the casting of lots. They cast a lot to find who would be the replacement for Judas, right? In the Bible, they're not condemned for that. There's other places where lots are cast. The Urim and Thummim is kind of a form of lot casting. The Day of Atonement sacrifice is a form of lot casting where you pick up a white and black stone. You don't know which hand they're going to be. You hold them over the goat and you find out which one God wants you to send to Azazel and which one he wants you to sacrifice. Right? Those are deductive divinations. But why are some allowed and some aren't? So we should understand how, there are four elements to understand how divinations were understood by the ancients. We're going to get some fancy words here. Semiotics, or how someone perceives the world around them, right? I.e., what do omens mean to them, right? Hermeneutics, we know this word, right? How divine communication was interpreted, including empirical assumptions, mystical development of the omen corpus, and the means by which information was procured. So, omen corpus would be like how an astrologer does all that weird stuff with star charts and claims the stuff matters to you or whatever. Then epistemology, right? This is knowing how you know something. That is what epistemology is. So what they believed they could know and how they could know it. And then the theology, right? How they perceived God. Those are the four things that will influence why Israelites are allowed to do stuff and other stuff they weren't allowed to do. So if Israelites are permitted to use lots to divine God's will, but not extapicy, that is the reading of sacrificial animal entrails, that's the official name for it, when both are examples of making an oracular request from the deity, i.e. asking God for a sign, right? You say, I'm going to cast these lots to God to determine which one of these men should be replacement for Judas. And then the lot tells you what God has revealed. Digging through animal entrails, you're like, God, I need to know. And then the intro somehow reveal that. It's the same idea. However, the difference is in how the sign is read. This is the important part. With lots, the human has no role in interpreting the message. Right? There's only going to be an answer. It's going to be unambiguous. Right? Like drawing straws, right? If there's one short straw and four big straws, it's unambiguous who drew the little straw. Right? There's no interpretation. However, the other forms of divination, the ones that are outlawed, require interpretation of multiple rules that have complicated interactions that require human interpretation. Let's look at astrology, right? The reading of celestial signs with those above categories and how that would work for the ancients, right? So, the Bible indicates to the Israelites believed in celestial occurrences, had significance, Joel 2:30. But nothing in Scripture talks about any approved way to interpret it beyond concluding that God was in control or something auspicious was happening, i.e. the birth of Jesus. Right? We read there are signs in the heavens that lead the wise men of Persia to conclude something momentous is happening. Right? Hermeneutics. The Bible gives zero instruction on how to interpret the rising, setting, colors, or positions of celestial bodies. Pagans had complicated rules for how to interpret these, just like modern astrology star charts do. The problem again with it is it requires human interpretation to take all these rules, all these edge cases, like it's this unless this, and all this complicated stuff, human interpretation. And if humans are interpreting it, they can get it wrong, or they can be corrupt and interpret it in their favor. Epistemology. Israel and the ancient Near East believed omens were their deity communicating with them. The pagans believed they could use omens to give guidance for specific decisions, even from kings to peasants. While for Israel, divine communication was designed to help the people know God and his plan. Right? That's it. So theology. God does communicate through celestial and terrestrial omens at times. Star of Bethlehem is an example of this. But the pagans not only believed in their complicated ways of divining the deity's will, but they had also rituals that could reverse a sign. If they got a message from their God that they didn't like, they could do a ritual to undo it. In other words, to use power to exercise control over their deity. God will not permit someone to compel him to action, right? You cannot control God, and doing so angers him because it's presumptive on your part. He created you, and then you think you can control him, right? The third commandment goes into this partly. Don't use God's name in magical rituals is one of the things the third commandment is telling us. And that's this right here. So, God can communicate through divination, but not in the complicated way that requires interpretation like the pagan way. When God uses dreams, for instance, he also tells his chosen prophet what the dream means. Joseph and Daniel are examples of this in the Bible. Yahweh's prophets do not speak in terms of omens like a pagan prophet would. They speak in terms of covenant, and how Israel can be blessed or cursed by how faithful they are to the covenant. We see this all the time with the prophets. You're doing bad, stop it, because you're violating the covenant, and there will be judgment if you don't stop. This will happen if you don't stop, right? Since Israel and the pagans believe that all events were caused by deity, and that deity communicated through events, that's the same thing, but it's how Israel and the pagans interacted with this idea that differs them, right? Again, you don't look at omens and try to divine God's will from that, right? You listen to a prophet, or you read what's already been revealed to us, right? For the pagans, they have complicated, man-created rules to interpret the omens or the words of a prophet, and they could use those rituals to change the outcome by exercising power over the deity. For Israel, the words delivered by a prophet are about how Israel can be blessed or cursed by their faithfulness to a covenant. And that applies to us, right? There are people today who go around claiming they're prophets and they're Christians, and we can test them. So now we ask to know if a word was spoken by Yahweh or not, right? So this is the question, right? How do we know if a prophet did this? Like, how are we really supposed to dig into this? And again, it's important, right? Just because a prophet makes a true prediction does not make him a true prophet. A true prophet speaks divine judgment. A false prophet will not know what decisions God has made about judgment. So if a prophet makes a proclamation of judgment and it does not happen, he does not know God's decisions and actions, right? It's not just being able to predict a future event, it's being able to talk about God's judgment and getting that right. Yes, a prophet can make those other sort of predictions to establish his bona fides, right? To prove that he is the natural prophet. But when he's talking about judgment and calling to repentance, and that stuff doesn't line up with the Bible, or the judgment doesn't happen, that's what you have to look for, right? The prophet needs to establish a track record that you can judge him on, and if that stuff doesn't come true, or it doesn't align with revealed existing inspired text for us, false prophet, right? I would also note this. You see this a lot in the charismatic world. There's a lot of prophets. They have a lot of feel-good things they say. That's what their messages tend to be, like, oh, you're going to be blessed by God. You know, you should do this business venture. You know, God's planting seeds in your life. Prophets in the Old Testament are condemning people for their sins and calling them to repentance and judging them if they don't, and telling them God is judging them, right? That's what a prophet does. That's how a prophet acted in the ancient world, and there's no reason to think that a true prophet of God today would be any different from that. And then we come to our final chapter, but do we have any questions about the divination stuff? Sort of understand now why God doesn't want you doing tarot cards and maybe complicated personality tests. There's one out there, the Enneagram, right? That's a very complicated personality test that's supposed to tell you things about yourself and about what you should be doing with your life. And it's gussied up in this sort of sciencey way that makes you think it's not divination. But the source of that is from a man who channeled and did automatic writing. No questions? Final chapter. It's a recap of the cities of refugees laws, the manslaughter laws, right? They're supposed to be equidistant to each other. That's important, right? You should be within about the same distance to any one of those cities no matter where you live, right? So they're not all grouped together, right? They're supposed to be spread out through the land so that they can serve their purpose. And the city's elders will, of course, judge that person. And here's what I really liked. A murderer with hate in his heart must be put to death, right? What did Jesus say about hating somebody? Yeah, it just jumped out at me. So, also, don't move the boundary stones for your neighbor's land, because that's theft against God. God gave him that land. He said these are the boundaries of his land, and if you're moving his boundary stones, you're stealing from God. Again, there must be 2 or 3 witnesses to establish any crime, not just, I saw him worshiping pagan deities in the earlier example. The witness is found to be lying. The liar suffers the same punishment as what the accused would have suffered. This is an object lesson to deter false accusations. And there are those today who think this should be brought back. And then verse 21, of course, is the you shall not pity. This is talking about putting someone to death. It shall be life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. This is known as the lex talionis, or the laws of retaliation. But they're really here to give the limit on what a punishment should be, right? The punishment to the person should not exceed the damage that they caused. And if they caused death, well, death is an appropriate punishment. All right, and that's where we're done for the week. We'll be doing 20 through 28 next week. We have a couple minutes if anyone has any comments or questions. And I do apologize about mixing up the horse thing. I just skipped right over that never word and went, oh, okay. Guess kings are allowed to amass horses. All right, well, if we don't have any questions or comments, we'll just end with a prayer. Heavenly Father, thank you for this time to study your word, and thank you for this time to get to know it, Lord, and to let the lessons resonate in our hearts, Lord, and just be with us, Lord, as we walk out into the world. In your name, amen.